Hi everybody, how we doing? Let me just set my stopwatch there for you. Okay, we're going. So thanks for having me again. Thanks Matt, thanks for the ISI for bringing us out here, and my second time here coming to Corvallis. I noticed something different this time. We drove from Portland down to Corvallis, and I didn't notice this last time, but we were coming down Interstate 5. There's a big Mormon temple right on the left side, you know where I'm talking about? Just right off the interstate there, and which surprised me because this is Oregon, and I thought you all believed in the separation of church and interstate. So is Christianity good for American politics? No. Thank you. First of all, which Christianity? Evangelical, Catholic, Baptist, Protestant, Lutheran, Pentecostal, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons? Which is the right Christianity we're supposed to inform our politics with? There's over 1,700 different Christian denominations in America alone. Which is the right one? Should politicians follow the morals of Mormon Christians, those who hold to the fundamentalist church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who believe that it is acceptable to force 13-year-old girls to have sex with men 5 times their age? Is that okay? No, that's not okay. What about Pentecostal Christians who indoctrinate young children into becoming warriors for Christ, willing to kill for the Lord? No, that's not such a good idea. How about evangelical Christians who believe so strongly in the sanctity of life that they blow up abortion clinics, kill abortion doctors, and tell women who are legitimately raped that their bodies will prevent the pregnancy? Should they be informing our politicians on policy? No. Or how about having a politician who is on the Committee for Science, Technology, and Space who thinks the Earth was created 9,000 years ago, just after farmers invented beer? Or what about Catholic Christians whose priestly pedophile program is, in the words of Christopher Hitchens, no child's behind left? No, this is not acceptable to let this inform our policies and our politics. My assessment of religion in general is summed up by how Winston Churchill described Americans. You can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Well, you can always count on religions to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Now, on the one hand, it doesn't really matter what religion somebody holds privately, as long as we all follow the principle of freedom. That is, the freedom to think and believe and act as we choose, so long as our beliefs and actions do not infringe on other people's freedoms to believe whatever they want. So as long as religion doesn't in any way interfere with my private life or public life, it's just a private matter, that's no problem. The problem is that the logic of religion is that it leads to belief in absolute moral principles that are true, which means that everybody else who disagrees with you must be wrong, and therefore they must be brought into the line. That is, every knee must bend to the truth. So as long as they don't believe that, we don't have a problem. But as you know, that is a problem. Furthermore, which holy book should we use to inform our politics? How about the Old Testament? Here's a gem for you. Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the girl, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Did anyone ask the woman how she feels about this process? Do you really want those kinds of laws and principles of morality informing modern 21st century American politics? Well, that's the Old Testament. There's a New Testament. It's new. By the way, when did Jesus become a conservative? I quote, "And again I say unto you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God." I don't know if Mr. Romney's read that one, but at any rate. Or Jesus said in Matthew 19:24, "If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell what thou hast and give it to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven." That doesn't sound like the conservative rhetoric we usually hear. Or, "I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And if you don't have a sword, sell your clothes and buy one." Okay, maybe that sounds like the conservative, yeah. So, the essence of the American experiment, what set it apart from all other political systems that came before or since, is that it's a secular system, not based in any religion. Secular doesn't mean anti-religious or discriminate against some religions. It just means no religion. Secular means no religion. The state of being separate from religion. So a secular state is officially and legally neutral in matters of religion. Therefore, government laws must have a secular justification. For example, we have laws against murder and theft and rape, not because it happens to be written in a book somewhere, but because we can prove that it does harm. This is why pedophilia is now a crime. We now know that it does harm. It's not because it's informed by some religion. The Roman Catholic Church may have an internal moral policy about, say, not eating meat on Fridays, and Catholics are free to follow this principle if they like. But if you want to make that a law, then you must show that meat is harmful to the public, and then it should be banned every day. The Atkins diet notwithstanding. Let me remind you of a few principles here of our country. The First Amendment of the Constitution says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Article 6, paragraph 3 of the U.S. Constitution states quite clearly that there is to be no religious test for office. No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson told the Danbury Baptists on January 1st, 1802, about building a wall of separation between church and state. Article 11 of the Treaty of Tripoli, read aloud and passed unanimously in the United States Senate and signed by President John Adams in 1797, stated clearly, quote, "The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." The Founding Fathers did not put "In God We Trust" on U.S. coins. That was done after the Civil War. Or on paper money. That was done in 1957 as a public statement against communism. The words "under God" were not part of the Pledge of Allegiance originally. It was added by Congress in 1954. Again, concerns about communism. I like the quote from Susan B. Anthony about the problem with putting "In God We Trust" as a national motto. "I distrust people who know so well what God wants them to do because I notice that it always coincides with their desires." In fact, a map of the world today shows that all successful societies have secular governments. Not one theocratical society is prospering. In fact, religions in democracies kept separate are the healthiest way to go. Just think about what you know sort of intuitively as you pan around the world. America is the most religious of the top 19 industrial democracies in the world. By far the most religious. How then do you explain that we have the highest rates of homicide, highest rates of suicide, highest STD rates, highest teen pregnancy rates, highest homicide rates, highest crime rates? If religion is so good for politics, how come it isn't working very well here in the most religious nation on earth? Or just go south to South America. All the South American countries are 99.9% Christian. Well, Catholic, but they're Christians, last time I checked. And they're not prosperous, capitalist, free market countries. They're struggling along in poverty. They also have high crime rates. Or go to Northern European countries, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and so forth, have very low rates of religiosity. Secular governments, of course, but the people themselves mostly do not believe in God. And yet, they are some of the most prosperous countries on earth. By the way, some of the most generous at giving money, donating money to social causes. By the way, on that statistic about who gives money, you have to control for income and GDP. It's an economic factor. Non-Western countries typically don't give as much money, in part because they have less money to give. It's a multifactorial issue, but I just have to point that out. And let me point out, too, one last thing in this first half. Separating church and state, keeping Christianity out of politics is not just good for politics, it's good for Christianity. Historically, whenever religions and governments have been intertwined, it's bad for religion. It may be temporarily good for the people in the dominant religion and bad for everybody else who doesn't happen to believe in what the dominant religious people believe. But what happens when the majority changes? So think about this. This is already happening in Northern Europe. What would happen if we changed the laws? We enabled the dominant religion in America, Christianity now, to become deeply infused in American politics, in policy, in lawmaking, legislation, and so forth. And say a century from now, the dominant religion was no longer Christianity. It was Islam. This is already happening in Europe. It could happen here. Do you still want on the books laws enabling the dominant religion to inform and control politics? Really? Be careful about what you hope for when you're in the dominant position, because when you're not, you're going to come to regret that. And then let me point out, too, about what Christians believe. Christians believe that a person must be free to choose the true religion, Christianity, to accept Jesus as their Savior or not. That means that we must be equally free to not choose that religion. That's what free will in the Christian worldview is all about. You have to be free to choose. If the government is telling you what you're supposed to believe, if the government is pushing the agenda of the dominant religion, you're losing your free choice to make the right or wrong choice about that religion. So if you're a Christian, you should be against Christianity being involved in American politics. It's better for your religion. I should point out that Christianity, one reason Christianity is so successful in America, more successful than Northern European countries, for example, is that we have separation of church and state. We have the freedom to believe whatever we want. Religions are free to do what they want to prosper. Just think about that for a minute. It's good for you. You should vote for keeping your own religion out of politics. I'll go over the slavery thing in my rebuttal, but I want to go over the 10 Commandments. This seems to be a hot-button issue. People very agitated and energetic about having the 10 Commandments posted in public places, courtrooms in particular, public parks. I should point out that most of the 10 Commandments postings were done in the 1950s by the Fraternal Order of Eagles, funded by none other than Cecil B. DeMille as a promotional gimmick for his film, The 10 Commandments. That's how that got started. In any case, these monuments represent the government establishment of religion in violation of the First Amendment, and 7 of them would be unconstitutional if they were enacted into civil law. So let's go over the 10 Commandments, see how many you remember. 1, thou shalt have no other gods before me. This violates freedom of religion. And by the way, you mean there's other gods? 2, thou shalt not make to thyself any graven images. This violates freedom of religion and freedom of artistic expression, much like the Taliban did in Afghanistan in destroying religious iconography. But what about the Christians who wear a crucifix? You know, you wear the cross. Isn't that a graven image? Can you imagine? I mean, think what the cross represents. It's an instrument of torture. Imagine Jews wearing little gas chambers on a chain. It's absurd. It's obscene. It's obscene to even say it. But I have to say it just to get you to think, yeah, the crucifix, it's an instrument of torture that was used on thieves, anybody, criminals, petty criminals. Why are we wearing that? What is that? What's the reason for that? The second part of the second commandment, For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me. The crimes of the father should be paid for by the son, the grandson, the great-grandson. This is quite unconstitutional. Number 3, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Well, this violates freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and not to mention reduces our vocabulary. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. This violates freedom of religion and reminds me of Dorothy Parker's answer to the question why she doesn't go to church on Sunday mornings. She said, because I'm too effing busy, and vice versa. I had to clean it up a little bit for the live streaming. I'm just quoting. Number 5, honor thy father and thy mother. Compelling loyalty is tantamount to slavery. You can't compel people by law to honor somebody else. Number 6, thou shalt not kill. Like we wouldn't have figured that out on our own. Number 7, thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, this violates our right to privacy, and there goes most of Congress. Number 8, thou shalt not steal. All cultures have moral laws about theft. You don't need Christianity for that. Number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Again, you don't need a holy book to tell you lying is wrong. Just ask the neighbor. Just ask the person potentially affected. I was thinking of stealing your stuff and lying to you or cheating on you. How would you feel about that? They'll let you know. Number 10, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, the neighbor's wife, or his manservant, or his maidservant, or his cattle, or anything about his that is the neighbor's. Well, at least women were close to the top of the list of property. That's a good start. But really, these are old, ancient, Bronze Age principles applicable to a people living in the desert that have next to no application to modern politics. Again, these kinds of moral principles that inform politics have to be thought out through in a secular perspective. What is the actual harm being done? Why are we doing it? And so on. Now, I need to say something about slavery, and I might come back to it in my rebuttal. But first of all, I should point out that the creator of the universe, at least as he wrote in the Holy Book, didn't even get it right on slavery. This is the simplest of moral problems. Is it okay to enslave people? The Holy Book of the Christians says it's fine. And if you look at the writings of 19th century American theologians, preachers, ministers, politicians, almost to a man, they all justified slavery with quotes from the Bible. I'll just give you a few. Reverend Alexander Campbell, there is not one verse in the Bible inhibiting slavery, but many regulating it. It is not then, we conclude, immoral. Jefferson Davis, slavery was established by decree of the Almighty God. It is sanctioned in the Bible in both Testaments, from Genesis to Revelation. It has existed in all ages, has been found among the people of the highest civilization, and in nations of the highest proficiency in the arts. United States Senator James Henry Hammond, The doom of Ham has been branded on the form and features of his African descendants. The hand of fate has united his color and destiny. Man cannot separate what God hath joined. Really? This was barely 100 years ago. Okay, so in other words, it may seem like a good idea to allow our politics to be formed by current Christian beliefs, but look what it did a century ago to the justification of the simplest of moral issues, slavery, and they didn't even get that right. Thank you.
Next, we'll have one round of rebuttals, so each speaker will be able to respond to the other speaker's opening statement. And we'll start with Mr. D'Souza for about 6 minutes.
If we think about slavery and the rationalizations for slavery, they're very transparent. And why? Because actually you don't need explanations for slavery. If people can get other guys to work all their lives for free, this is a pretty good arrangement for the slave owner. And so therefore you've had slavery be so common and so widespread. It is rooted in human selfishness, and it doesn't really require too much of an explanation beyond that. What does require explanation is why people who stood to benefit from slavery turned against it. In other words, historically, there's always been one group that's opposed slavery, and that group is called slaves. So, in every culture, you have runaways, slave revolts. But only in Western culture has there been an opposition to slavery in principle. So here's Abraham Lincoln. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Lincoln doesn't want to be a slave, we understand that. But he doesn't want to be a master either. Why not? Where does that kind of principle come from? Where people who stand to benefit themselves nevertheless turn, and not only turn, but are willing to fight a bloody war in which hundreds of thousands of people who could have been slave owners get killed to defend a principle that is of no benefit to themselves, at least not directly. That idea comes out of the principle of human equality, and my point is the principle of human equality is injected into the West and into America by Christianity. If it didn't come from there, where else did it come from? Now, all this stuff about keeping Christianity out of politics. My first question is, why are we trying to keep Christianity out of politics? We don't try to keep anything else out of politics. Are we trying to keep feminism out of politics, homosexuality out of politics, patriotism out of politics, economic gain out of politics? No. All these other things are okay to be in politics. All these other things are okay for you to vote based on. But this one thing, Christianity, you have to exclude. And my question is, based upon what? What makes Christianity so evil, so perverse, that every other principle, their weaknesses are ignored? Take patriotism. Patriotism is a good thing, I admit, but patriotism is susceptible to all those same abuses that Michael Shermer talked about. People kill in the name of their country. People make other people, my country, right or wrong. Do what my country says or get out of here. Why is patriotism okay to belong in politics but not Christianity? So what I'm getting at here is this secularism camouflages anti-religious bigotry. It pretends to be neutral, but it singles out this one thing and basically says everything else is okay except this one thing. And my question again is, why? Michael Shermer is very exercised about the Ten Commandments. All right, let's walk to every museum and state capital of America. You see all kinds of monuments. Monument to Voltaire. Monument to Tom Paine. And that's okay. Voltaire's principles are very controversial, but nevertheless, if somebody proposed to have a monument to Voltaire, it would be debated on the merits. How much does Voltaire done to influence America, and so on. But if somebody wanted to put up a monument to Moses or to Jesus, then Michael Shermer and all his friends would be out there demonstrating, take it down, separation of church and state. Now, it's quite possible, in fact, it's inarguable, that Moses and Jesus have had far more influence on American laws and American society than Voltaire, but nevertheless, no debate is even permitted on the merits. This is not allowed at the outset. This is supposed to be really scary. This is supposed to threaten our democracy. And I'm simply saying, putting aside all the nonsense, give me one good reason why we can't debate these issues on their merits. Why can't we say, did Jesus have a good or a bad influence in the world? If all the world followed Jesus' teachings, would the world be a better place or a worse place? Would America be better or worse if it followed the teachings of Christianity? I'm not even taking a position in this debate. I'm simply saying, let's have it. Michael Shermer would have that debate stopped at the beginning. Why? Because Jesus was a religious figure. Therefore, since we have separation of church and state, this cannot be permitted to even be discussed. Now, what about all the stuff about the Mormons and the evangelical Christians and all these different groups, and they believe this and they believe that? There's a fundamental confusion that's going on here. And it's a confusion that goes to the heart of what we mean when we talk about religious liberty and what the founders were trying to protect against. The founders were not trying to protect against injecting morality into politics. Morality belongs in politics. Virtually every serious political debate has a moral component. If you remove the language of is this right, is this wrong, you could almost not have a political debate on any subject. So clearly, morality does belong in politics. The real issue is that the founders were trying to keep theology out of politics while allowing, indeed insisting, that politics be the domain of morality. So in other words, if we're debating the Trinity, we leave that out of politics. And why? There's actually a good reason. Because the belief in the Trinity is in the province of revelation. And therefore, it doesn't really belong in democratic politics because you can't convince somebody else of a principle that is ultimately based on a revealed truth. None of the moral issues depend for their case on revelation. Michael Shermer mentioned gay marriage, abortion. I'll come back to those because my time is up. But the point I want to make is theology, no. The morality that comes out of Christianity, not only is that permitted in American politics, it's indispensable to it. Thank you.
Okay. Why are we so angry? We're not angry. Atheists are not angry. What we don't like is the dominant religion trying to force its beliefs on everybody else that doesn't happen to believe that. We believe in freedom of religion. It's very simple. I don't know if Dawkins is angry or not, but do I seem like an angry guy? I'm not angry about religion. Morality in politics, yes, of course, but we're not debating what is the role of morality in politics. We're debating a very specific point. But I would just generalize about religions in American politics. We just happen to be talking about Christianity because we're in America. But if we were somewhere else, I would I would make the same arguments for any religious infusion into politics. But I would separate that from morality. Of course, we should have thoughtful debates and discussions about the moral implications of public policy. Yes, Dinesh, that's what it's all about. But what is the origins of these moral principles? Where did we get these? So let's talk about that for a second. The principle that human life is precious and sacred. By the way, this isn't my line, but it got me thinking about this, that Republicans are pro-life all the way up until birth. Was that George Carlin? Okay. Thank you. The idea that, in fact, all life all people should not be treated as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves, is Immanuel Kant's idea. That's an Enlightenment idea. That's a principle that came out of the Enlightenment, the age of reason. So you have the scientific revolution, the age of reason, the attempt to apply the principles of Newtonian mechanics to all society and the economy and politics, the attempt to use reason and empiricism and experiments to understand the world. That's culminated in the Enlightenment. And the founding fathers of this nation were primarily, if nothing else, Enlightenment figures, well-educated in Enlightenment values, reading the great philosophers. They may have been, some of them Christian, some of them were deists, some of them were this or that. That's kind of a separate historical topic that's fun to explore, but not relevant here. What happened is that there had to be a secular justification for the moral principle, regardless of what the religious historical influence was on where that principle came from. So again, back to the morality informing politics, yes, of course, but what's the justification? What's your reason? You have to give us a reason. You can't just say, well, you know, it says so in that book. Yeah, it says a bunch of stuff in that book that we wouldn't follow today, so forget the book. Let's see if we can actually reason our way to that particular moral principle. Even Jesus' teachings, sure, let's look at what he said and see if we can reason our way to applying certain principles or not. Not just because he said it, but what are the implications of what he said? Some of it's fine, some of it, the negative quotes I read, not so good. Why did the West succeed? Okay, this is like a huge topic I can't cover in 2 minutes. Essentially, it isn't religion. If you look at the time frame, the time unfolding, the chronology, religion is almost always slightly behind the wave. They're always like a few decades behind. What does it are the biggest inputs to the triumph of the West are liberal democracy, free trade, and membership in intergovernmental organizations. That is, being involved in the world in a complex way. Evil happens in secret. Transparency, open borders. This is what has driven the West forward and has made us more moral. I can't summarize, for example, Steven Pinker's 800-page book in 2 minutes, but the data set is there. It's quite clear, and religion never leads it. They're always just behind the wave. And that's exactly what happened with slavery. Yes, of course, you can find religious leaders that supported it. William Wilberforce. But who were these anti-slavery abolitionists writing against? Not atheists, because there were hardly any atheists anyway. But it certainly wasn't atheists saying, we must keep slavery going. No, it was religious people. It was the fellow Christians that they were writing against. And it took a long time, centuries. Well, Dinesh quoted 4th century, and it wasn't until the 19th century that we finally abolished it. That's a long time for all those Christians to hang on to that institution. And as I said, it's the simplest of moral issues, and they couldn't even get it right on that one. So, separation of powers, checks and balances, the nature of human nature, these are all Enlightenment discussions. These are all principles that came out of the Enlightenment. So, I'll finish with this. Dinesh said I would bring this up, so okay, here goes. Gay marriage. I'll just give you my prediction. Here's what's going to happen. In about a decade, maybe 2, maybe 3, but I'm thinking 2. This gay marriage thing will be just like the black and white drinking fountains of the 1950s, and we look back now and go, what were they thinking? But that's not my prediction. My prediction is the Christians will take credit for it. They'll find some Anglican minister that spoke out against his fellow Christians and said, you know what, this is not fair to discriminate against gays. And they'll say, you see, that was our guy. Okay, whatever it takes to get there, but just remember that as we live, as this history unfolds, that's what's going to happen. Thank you.
So we'll now move to a discussion section for tonight's debate, for which we have about 10 minutes. I misspoke earlier. The speakers will alternate asking questions of one another, and I will allow for free-form discussion in general. I'll kind of guide as to whether we need to switch who's asking the questions, but usually this is pretty productive just for the speakers to converse with each other. Speakers, please limit answers to 1 or 2 minutes as our time is limited. Also, I'd like to remind the audience to remain respectful of our speakers by not applauding until the very end of the section. And then after that, we'll have audience questions, so just hold all your questions till then. And with that, Dr. Shermer, would you like to start with the question?
Okay. Whoa.
Oh, we have sound.
Sounds like God is here. You know, I was once a Christian. I went to Pepperdine University, and I went around knocking on people's doors to tell them about Jesus. And then I became an atheist, and I went back knocking on their doors to tell them I was wrong. And then, so Dinesh, assuming that you believe that Christianity should inform American politics, which particular brand of Christianity, what principles and where do you get them, say, from the Bible? Which principles would you pluck out of there to inform politicians or policy?
That is a truly bizarre question for this reason. It would never occur for you to ask that question in any other context. In other words, if a union guy asked for a pay increase, you'd never say, "Where are you getting that idea from? What is its source? Are you appealing to reason?" You just assume the guy wants a pay increase and he's going to vote for a candidate that's like him, who's going to give him the pay increase, right? So my question is this. You're asking me which denomination? I say that each Christian should apply his or her own convictions and vote for the candidate that has a set of political and social and moral views closest to what they believe. That's what everybody else does. So why should the Christians be any different?
Okay, that's a good point. I would agree that privately you should vote your conscience. We all do that. But I'm not sure that's what we're debating. Aren't we debating, should it like officially, legally inform politics in some way? Or maybe that's not what you mean.
Right, that's not what I mean. In other words, if you look at, you cited a bunch of laws from the Old Testament, for example. Now, as you know, in the very beginning of Christianity, you read about this debate in the Acts of the Apostles. There was an argument among the early Christians about whether the Christians should, not even about others, themselves follow those Jewish laws. And this debate was won by Paul, who said no. He said those laws are from the Old Covenant, they were for the Jews, but we're not going to follow them. So for 2,000 years, Christianity has in its practice rejected following the ancient Jewish code. And so I don't understand how educated atheists who should know that go around pretending that Christians today want to stone people and want to beat their children and you dredge these laws out of the Old Testament. They were rejected about the year 30 AD. And you're still talking about them as though we're advocating them in the 21st century.
Well, but it seems like we are because people still quote from them. And that's why I brought up the Ten Commandments monuments. Why does anybody want to post these in courtrooms and public parks? Because they want to sort of signal this is what we believe. But you can't possibly believe that. So
well, why not?
Well, you wouldn't endorse any of those commandments being turned into law.
Well, but are you telling me that if somebody puts a quotation by Voltaire on the top of this building, that they're requiring that everyone in this audience follow that law? Is that why they're putting it up there? Is it have the force of law, or does it have the force of stating that America's moral and political and even religious roots are in the Old Testament and in the Bible and in the laws of Moses and Jesus? Isn't that the point?
If we were going to do that, then we would need to include all the Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and Voltaire and so on who also influenced. So, in other words, we're just talking about historical antecedents to where these laws came from. And we posterize our heroes, okay, but in a legal context, none of that matters. We need to justify the laws on secular values. Wouldn't you agree? There has to be some reason for the law, separate from whatever anybody's holy book says.
Well, let's think about that for a moment. I mean, certainly I agree that if you're trying to convince somebody about why something is wrong, and if they don't share your premise, let's say, for example, I think that abortion is wrong because Christianity prohibits it. And then I think abortion is wrong. I can stand up in a church and preach to fellow Christians, and they might go, well, yeah, you can cite the relevant passages in the Bible and so on. But obviously, if I'm speaking at Oregon State, it makes no sense for me to say abortion is wrong or gay marriage is wrong because of the book of Leviticus. I'm going to get nowhere. So yeah, I understand completely that I would have to make completely secular arguments that would appeal to common reason, but this is nothing more than common sense. The early Christians, when they went out and they encountered the Hindus and the Persians and the Romans, who all had different cosmologies and different theologies, understood perfectly well 2,000 years ago that they couldn't use the same Jewish language. It just wasn't going to work. They had to apply a different way of persuasion. So I agree. Yeah, if a Christian is going to make an argument to a non-Christian, you have to appeal to common reason. But I don't see how you can impose that as a legal requirement. It's not imposed as a requirement in any other context. If somebody proposed laws in any other area, nobody insists that those laws meet some independent test of reason. We simply debate whether the law should be passed or not.
Well, I would argue that's a shortcoming then, that we need to inform our debates with reason and evidence.
I mean, let's look at American politics right now. Would you agree that the majority of people who are voting for either candidate or on any issue, are they most likely voting on the basis of some Enlightenment concept of objective, detached reason? Or are they actually voting on the basis of a kind of a molten lava of self-interest, prejudice, anger, this guy looks sick, that guy's a weirdo? Which is the reality?
Neither.
Neither?
Neither. No, we know this now. Most people vote by their political party tribe based on what moral principles in general they adhere to. Liberals tend to think we have to take care of the poor, harm care, reciprocity, fairness, and so forth. It doesn't matter who it is. They're going to vote. Okay, Romney's 47% gaffe. It wasn't really a gaffe. The gaffe part was how many pay taxes. The non-gaffe part was he's going to get 47% no matter what. Obama's going to get 47% no matter what. That's political tribalism.
Well, Michael, let's do this. We have some area of political overlap, so this will help us to clarify the principle. We have Obama keeps saying, for example, that people are not paying their fair share, right?
Yep.
Now, we know that about 1/2 of Americans pay no income taxes. We know that people who are in the top 1% pay about 30% of the federal taxes. People in the top 10% pay about 60% collectively of federal taxes. Now, you think that somebody who goes around talking about the fair share would require some reason to say why it is fair that 1/2 of the United States pays no federal taxes at all. In other words, we have no taxation without representation, but apparently 1/2 of the country has representation without taxation. Why is that fair? Right? So all I'm saying is never once has the leading apostle of the principle of fair share, Obama, given a single reason to say why this group should pay this much more and this group should pay this much less. Rather, he simply chants the phrase as though it's self-evident and expects people to vote on it. So where is the public reason that you're demanding of Christianity? Where is it in secular politics?
I agree.
Thank you.
Well, I can just tell you what the argument is. What do you mean by fair? Do you mean fair as in raw dollar amount? Well, Romney paid 2.5 orders of magnitude more taxes than I did. And yet, I pretty much got the same social services he gets. I get the same interstate highways and so forth. So that doesn't seem fair to him. But on the other hand, liberals are defining fair in a different way, not raw dollar amount, but percentage of how much you make and how much you need and that sort of thing. So I would agree we should apply reason to that. But that isn't what happens. It's an emotional, psychological, sort of moral psychology that we vote on. And this would be anti-enlightenment, anti-reason. I think we can improve our politics. First, it'd be nice to have a strong third party so that we have more choices. Go libertarians. But even so, a party that would base the principles on some sort of reason, like let's define fairness. It'd be nice if somebody would do that. So I think we're in agreements there.
Okay, well now let's look at a Christian issue, which would be something like abortion. Now, Would you agree that one can make completely secular arguments against abortion?
Okay, I think this comes down to, yes, of course, you could do it. Both sides have tons of arguments, and we all know what they are because we've seen these debates. So I think it comes down to this. You have to sort of do a triage or make a decision. What's the higher moral principle? The right of a woman to choose versus the life of a fetus, okay? And there's no science, I have not been able to figure out a scientific way to like make the decision on that. That it isn't possible to do that. Other than in a moral philosophy argument, you could say an adult woman who's already a citizen and fully functioning has higher moral standing than a fetus that hasn't even been born yet. You could make that argument. I do make that argument because I'm pro-choice. Even though I would personally be anti-abortion, I would not want to do that personally, but as a public policy, pro-choice. And I would use that argument about the moral standing of one versus the other. And also one last point I also use. Historically, when women gain more reproductive rights, it's better for the society as a whole. We can measure that in terms of all kinds of metrics about giving women more freedom and power is good for society, and that's one of the biggies.
Do you believe that the fetus, the unborn child, has any claim to life?
Yes, but the adult woman has a higher claim to life and moral decisions.
Right, but we're not talking about the adult woman's life being at stake.
No, I'm just talking across the board. And again, separating the personal choice. A woman goes, well, I don't believe in abortion, so I'm not going to have an abortion. Okay, fine. Whatever reason. But having the state tell her what she can and cannot do, that's what I object to.
Right, but what I object to is it seems to me that your argument is based on moral evasion. You say that you yourself would not, I mean, you can't have an abortion, obviously, but presumably if your daughter got pregnant, you wouldn't want her to have an abortion.
That's right.
What I'm saying is there's only one reason to feel that way, and that is that the unborn infant, the fetus, does have some claim on life.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. That's the only reason to feel that way. All right. Now, once you say that, the argument about choice loses its force. You have to roll the clock a little bit back to Abraham Lincoln in the debate with Stephen Douglas on slavery. I'm not trying some crude analogy between the two, but Douglas basically says, listen, let's be pro-choice. Let each state vote up or down on slavery. I don't care if they want it. If they don't want it, don't have it. So basically what Douglas is saying is let's agree to disagree. We can't make everybody feel the same way. We can't impose our values on each other. Let's agree to disagree. Let's have the pro-choice position, but not on the individual basis, but let each state decide for itself. So to this, Abraham Lincoln replies the following. Namely, choice is meaningless without reference to what is being chosen. And Lincoln says if you are deciding whether or not to own a horse, then you can be free choice because we acknowledge at the outset that the horse has no claim to independent autonomy. But Lincoln says if you say that the Negro is a human being, then the argument for choice collapses completely. Yes. Because you can't be indifferent to what is being chosen. So my point on the abortion issue is simply this, and notice that I've mentioned no religious categories, I haven't appealed to scripture or revelation or the Bible. I'm simply saying that this is to me is a good example of how if we're having the abortion debate, so many guys jump up and say, let's leave the pro-choice position, the pro-life position out because it's a religious position. No, it's not. It is anchored in the same secular moral reasoning that you use to justify the other side, but it seems to me to come from a stronger place. It says choice must be based upon the content of choice.
It is a moral choice, and you can make... Yep.
I'll let you respond, and then that'll be the end.
Okay, that's fine. So following your analogy, which is good, a slave is a fully functioning adult human that somebody cannot own. That's that moral principle. A fetus does not have the same moral standing as an adult. And so again, I would, if you have to choose, we have to make a choice about this, you have to vote on it, whatever, I would choose that the moral standing of the mother is slightly higher than the moral standing of the fetus, and that therefore having the state tell a woman what she can and cannot do in the reproductive area is morally wrong, or it's worse than allowing the choice to be made, even though you may personally not want to do that. So again, it's the state imposing its power over another person, an adult person versus the fetus.
All right, so we're now going to move to audience questions. First question from the left-hand line, please.
Yeah, we have, on the one hand, a country of 300 million people that needs to be run. On the other hand, some of us are saying, well, maybe we should all accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have any idea how ridiculous that is?
I'm unmoved by the self-evident absurdity that you're referring to. I'm not sure, what is so ridiculous about it? Why is it different than any other principle? Everybody should help the poor. Is that self-evidently ridiculous to you?
Would you like to refine your question really quick?
Why should we let fairy tales into the United States government?
Okay.
Is it a question for me? Oh. The fact that Jesus Christ should be your personal Savior is not something that we should let be part of our government. You should be very relieved to know. No Christian is advocating that.
That's right. No, the next one. I
was hoping you could expand a little bit more on what you mean by good for politics.
Good for politics. I think it's for you.
Well, it's for both of you, Jeff. I was hoping to address to both.
Oh, okay. Well, right. That's an important question. What do we mean by it being good for politics? I would argue that it's the metric we're using is, does it somehow lead us to more rational, reasonable policies? Can we get less divisiveness between the two parties in congressional votes? Can the candidates have a reasonable discussion without it being clouded over? I guess that would be the metric for me on whether it's good or not. Especially for those who don't believe it, who are not Christian. Do they feel equally represented? That would be the metric.
I would argue, and even on moral principles where you might disagree with Christianity, it's good for politics because it's introducing an element into the debate that without which the debate would be more impoverished. So let's take, for example, the debate about gay marriage. To some people, the debate about gay marriage is a fait accompli. It's a very simple argument because, after all, we have had a civil rights movement which began with the black civil rights movement, and then along came the women's rights movement, which basically piggybacks on the black civil rights movement and is seen as morally indistinguishable from it. And then along comes the gay rights movement, which, according to Michael Shermer, is simply the third wave of the civil rights movement, morally indistinguishable from the other two, and therefore destined to achieve complete victory, which will even bring the Christians along in its wake.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Now, precisely this kind of thing and the mindless applause that follows it shows that we are inattentive to huge distinctions in between these three causes. First of all, being black is not the same thing as the differences between men and women. In fact, when it comes to men and women, in many areas we have segregation. Recently we had the great tennis tournament, and I noticed that men only play against men and women only play against women. Separate but equal. The very things that we would completely reject in the area of race, we unthinkingly accept in the area of gender because we know that gender is different than race. Sexual orientation is another thing altogether. So, when you talk about something like gay marriage, the first thing you have to ask is, what is the point of marriage? You can't discuss reforming something without looking at the form itself. What's the point of the original thing? Why does society subsidize marriage? Why does society care? Why should society make marriage into a special thing and give it all kinds of benefits? What is society getting out of it? Why don't people just be free to make contracts with each other? So what I'm getting at is the argument for gay marriage is not just about gay marriage, it's about what is marriage. Traditionally, societies have subsidized marriage not because there are consenting adults or because people love each other. It's because society has a direct stake in the bearing and rearing of the next generation. If parents didn't look after those children, the state would be faced with an almost incalculable cost of supporting them. So the point being here, notice again, made no references to the Old or the New Testament. I'm making arguments anchored in reason, but drawing on a moral tradition that has in part been formed by Christianity. So what I'm saying is this. You remove the Christian side of the debate, and we have a thinner, more simplistic, unself-critical debate. Even if you end up disagreeing with what Christianity is saying, it's forcing an examination of something more at the level of first principles. So I would argue that whether or not you agree with the Christian position, and there is no Christian position in an official sense, nevertheless, the injection of Christian moral reasoning into this debate elevates the politics and the discussion of gay marriage.
Next question, please.
This is for Mr. D'Souza. The premise of your position is the claim that Christianity is the root of morality. Wouldn't it be more honest to say that Christianity is credited with melding numerous ideas into one that so far has survived the longest?
I don't think that Christianity is the root of morality, nor do I think that morality in general is the exclusive preserve of Christianity. I think that morality is built in to human nature. When I look at the Ten Commandments, which is, Jewish rather than Christian, but nevertheless, it's not that I discover any moral truth in there. It's rather that I recognize it. I don't go, lying is wrong, adultery is wrong, wow, never thought of that. Rather, I read it and I go, lying is wrong, that's right. Stealing is wrong, that's right. In other words, I already knew. Well, how did I know? I knew because of the moral voice of conscience that is equally present in the Christian and the Hindu and the Muslim and the atheist, all of them. Now, the Christian view is that that moral voice has been put in human beings by God. But whether you believe that or not, no one is claiming that Christianity supplies this type of morality to human beings. Now, there's a different claim.
Mr. D'Souza, could you let Dr. Shermer answer the question as well?
Sure.
We're running out of time. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yep, that's fine.
I'm starting to do the math.
Yeah, so I agree with Dinesh that the moral principles, the moral sense is within. We disagree on what the origin is of it, but that's okay. I think the more important point is it's not that we lack morality. Everybody thinks they're moral. There was a study done on psychopaths in jail who are serial killers. To a man, they all think that the guy had it coming. I did the most moral thing when I killed him. And so everybody thinks they're moral. No one ever started a war that didn't think this was a moral thing to do. So having enough morality, that's not the issue. And again, we have to remember, before, say, 1850, most American Christians believed that slavery was moral. So we can't just go by our intuitions, because our intuitions may be wrong on morality. We have to use reason and have debate with other people to check whether we're being reasonable or not.
Next question, please.
This question is for Dinesh. I just want to say I disagree with you, but I love listening to you talk. You're very slick. I'm sorry. So you said something about that our Greek philosophy has come to us through a filter of Christianity over millennia, but I can read Plato, Socrates, all this stuff directly, their words. So could you clarify? I didn't understand what you meant, how that filter is there.
Well, what I was trying to say is that when we look at Greek society through history, it is almost unimaginably different than the society we live in. You take simply, for example, the simple principle of pederasty, which was institutionalized in Greek culture, not just institutionalized as a sort of eccentric practice, it was actually more prominent in the aristocratic segments of Greek society. And it was actually intrinsic to the Greek philosophy of education. In other words, the older man and the younger boy, in a sense, exchange something, one for the other. And there is an essay in Greek philosophy which talks about how when the younger boy runs away and finds another older man, he's actually cheating the older man of what is rightfully his. What I'm getting at is all of this is so incomprehensibly alien to us now. So when we read it now, what do we do with it? We sort of set it aside. And we talk about the glories of Greek civilization and the wonders of Rome, and we talk about Plato and Aristotle and so on. And what I'm getting at is we're actually referring to Plato and Aristotle as interpreted by the early Christian thinkers who baptized those philosophers, who basically said, let's read this part of Socrates and admire it, and let's read that part of Plato and cherish it. So we're getting, in a certain way, a lens through which we see the ancients, and that lens is supplied by 1,000 years of Christian understanding. See, it's impossible for us to escape history, right? Just as it's difficult for me to see the world except through the eyes, for example, of a young Indian born in Bombay who was raised by a certain set of parents. They supply lenses to me through which I see the world. I can't escape those, however hard I try. Similarly, I'm saying here in the West, when we look at our own past, we see it through the lens of our later ancestors who helped us to understand the ones that came before. That's all I'm trying to say. We're not getting unvarnished Greece and Rome. If we got it, we would all run out of the room. But we're getting it as it was softened and humanized by the Christians, and that's why we admire it so much.